The champagne flutes were already chilled. The orchestra had confirmed their arrival time, and the 5-course menu had been finalized down to the last garnish when my granddaughter Emma looked me straight in the eye and said, "Grandma Bertha, I've decided you're not invited to my wedding." The words hit me like a physical blow, but what she didn't know was that I'd been writing checks for months, $200,000 worth of checks, for her dream reception, the one she'd been planning since she was 7 years old, sketching table arrangements on napkins during family dinners. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I didn't argue, I didn't beg. I just nodded quietly, kissed her forehead like I always did, and walked out of her apartment with my dignity intact, and my checkbook burning a hole in my purse. What happened next would teach my entire family that grandmother's love comes with conditions, and disrespect comes with consequences they never saw coming. My name is Bertha Wilson, and at 73 years old, I've learned that respect isn't inherited, it's earned, and sometimes it has to be demanded. For the past 45 years, I've been the steady heartbeat of our family, the one who remembered birthdays, hosted holidays, and kept everyone connected through the inevitable storms that come with loving, complicated people. My late husband Robert used to joke that I was the family's emotional accountant, always keeping track of who owed what in terms of care, attention, and love. Robert passed 3 years ago after a brief but brutal battle with pancreatic cancer, leaving me alone in our sprawling colonial house in Westchester County with too many bedrooms and not nearly enough laughter echoing through the halls. The silence was deafening at first, but I'd learned to fill it with purpose. Garden club meetings on Tuesdays, book club on Thursdays, and volunteer work at the local literacy center every other Saturday. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for my golden years, but it was peaceful, predictable, and mine. The trouble started, as family trouble often does, with something that should have been joyful. Emma, my youngest son David's daughter, had gotten engaged to a young man named Marcus during a romantic weekend in the Hamptons. She'd called me breathlessly that Sunday evening, practically vibrating with excitement as she described the proposal, the ring, and her vision for what she called the wedding of the century. I listened with the kind of patient enthusiasm that grandmothers perfect over decades, asking all the right questions and making all the appropriate sounds of delight. Emma had always been special to me, though I tried never to show favoritism among my 4 grandchildren. She was artistic, sensitive, and possessed an almost otherworldly ability to see beauty in the smallest details. As a child, she would spend hours at my house during summer visits, arranging flowers from my garden into elaborate bouquets and creating elaborate tea parties for her stuffed animals. She had dreams as big as her imagination, and watching her grow into a talented graphic designer who could command impressive fees for her work had been one of my greatest joys. So when she mentioned during that excited phone call that she'd always dreamed of having her reception at the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, complete with a full orchestra, imported flowers, and a guest list of 200, I didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you need, sweetheart," I said, already mentally calculating the cost and deciding it didn't matter. Grandma will make sure your day is perfect. What I didn't expect was the immediate pushback from her parents. David, my younger son, who'd inherited his father's practical nature but none of his warmth, called me the next morning with what he termed concerns about Emma's expectations. His wife Sarah, who'd never quite warmed to me despite 22 years of marriage to my son, had apparently calculated that Emma's dream wedding would cost more than they'd spent on their own house. "Mom, you can't just promise her the moon," David said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone he'd perfected since graduating business school. "Sarah and I have been saving for this wedding since Emma started dating seriously, and we've got a reasonable budget worked out. $15,000 for the whole thing. That's more than generous." I'd listened quietly, stirring my morning coffee and watching the cardinals at my bird feeder through the kitchen window. $15,000 for the wedding of the century. It was laughable, really, but I didn't laugh. Instead, I'd made non-committal sounds and promised to discuss it with Emma directly. The conversation with my granddaughter that afternoon had been more illuminating than comfortable. Emma had confided that her parents thought her ideas were unrealistic, and that she should be grateful for whatever they could afford. She'd already started compromising, looking at smaller venues, considering a DJ instead of live music, and talking about making her own centerpieces to save money. "But Grandma," she'd said, her voice small and disappointed, "I've been dreaming about this since I was little. Remember how we used to plan my imaginary wedding when I was 7? The one with the crystal chandeliers and the chocolate fountain?" I remembered. I remembered everything about those lazy summer afternoons when Emma would curl up beside me on the porch swing, describing in elaborate detail the wedding she would have someday. The dress that would sparkle like starlight, the flowers that would smell like heaven, the cake that would be tall enough to touch the clouds. Those weren't just childhood fantasies to her. They were promises she'd made to her younger self, dreams she'd been nurturing for 2 decades. That night, I'd made my decision. I called my financial advisor, a sharp woman named Patricia, who'd been managing my investments since Robert's death, and asked her to liquidate some bonds. Not all of them, certainly not enough to jeopardize my own security, but enough to cover what Emma would need for her dream day. $200,000. It sounds like an enormous sum, and it was, but it represented less than 8% of what Robert and I had managed to save over 4 decades of careful financial planning. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Wilson?" Patricia had asked, her voice carefully neutral. "That's a significant gift, and there might be tax implications to consider." I'd assured her I was certain, and we'd arranged for the funds to be transferred to a separate account I could draw from as needed. I didn't tell David and Sarah about my decision immediately. I wanted to see how the wedding planning progressed, wanted to understand the family dynamics before revealing my hand. What I discovered over the following weeks was deeply troubling. Emma's parents weren't just being practical about money. They were actively undermining her confidence, dismissing her ideas as childish, and making her feel guilty for wanting something beautiful. Sarah, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in shooting down Emma's suggestions, often with cutting remarks about keeping things realistic and not everyone can have a fairy tale. The breaking point came during a family dinner at David and Sarah's house in early October. Emma had brought color swatches and venue brochures, hoping to get her parents excited about her plans. Instead, Sarah had flipped through the materials with barely concealed disdain, making comments about spending money we don't have, and, quote, setting unrealistic expectations. "Emma, honey," Sarah had said in that syrupy tone that always made my skin crawl, "maybe it's time to think about what really matters. The marriage, not the party. Some of us had lovely weddings without breaking the bank." The implication was clear and cruel. Sarah and David had married in a simple ceremony at the local country club, with a modest reception that featured a cash bar and a buffet dinner. It had been perfectly nice, but it hadn't been Emma's dream, and there was no reason she should have to settle for her mother's idea of appropriate. That's when I'd spoken up. "Actually," I'd said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care, "I think Emma should have exactly the wedding she wants, and I'm prepared to help make that happen." The silence that followed was deafening. David looked confused, Sarah looked suspicious, and Emma looked hopeful for the first time in weeks. "What do you mean, help?" Sarah had asked, her voice sharp. "I mean I'm going to pay for it," I'd said simply. "The whole thing. The plaza, the orchestra, the flowers, whatever Emma wants. Consider it my wedding gift to my granddaughter." The explosion that followed was spectacular. David accused me of undermining their parental authority. Sarah suggested I was being manipulative and trying to buy Emma's affection. Even Emma seemed overwhelmed, caught between gratitude and guilt as her parents ranted about my inappropriate interference. I'd let them vent, waiting until the storm subsided before speaking again. "This is not about undermining anyone," I'd said calmly. "This is about a grandmother who wants to give her granddaughter a beautiful start to her marriage. If you object to that, perhaps we should examine why." But even as I made my generous offer, I'd sensed undercurrents I didn't fully understand. Over the following days, as Emma and I began planning in earnest, I started to notice things. The way Sarah's eyes would narrow when Emma mentioned our conversations. The way David would change the subject whenever the wedding came up. The subtle but persistent attempts to make Emma feel guilty about accepting my gift. It was my older son Michael who finally explained what I was really dealing with. Michael had always been the more emotionally intelligent of my 2 boys, perhaps because he'd married a woman who actually liked me. During a quiet conversation over lunch at our favorite bistro, He'd laid out the family dynamics with uncomfortable clarity. "Mom," he'd said, cutting his sandwich into precise triangles the way he'd done since childhood, "David and Sarah are threatened by your relationship with Emma. They think you're trying to be the favorite grandparent, and Sarah in particular feels like you're showing off how much more money you have than they do." I'd considered this carefully. "And what do you think?" I'd asked. Michael had smiled, the same lopsided grin he'd inherited from his father. "I think you're a grandmother who loves her granddaughter and wants to do something wonderful for her."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
But I also think you might want to be careful about how you handle this. David's pride is fragile, and Sarah's insecurity runs deep. His warning proved prophetic. Over the next several weeks, as Emma and I worked with wedding planners and florists and caterers, the tension in the family escalated. David started making pointed comments about spoiled children and unrealistic expectations. Sarah began having private conversations with Emma about the burden of accepting such an expensive gift and whether it was fair to the other grandchildren. The other grandchildren, Michael's 2 teenage sons and my daughter Lisa's 8-year-old daughter, became unwitting pawns in Sarah's campaign to make me look like a manipulative grandmother playing favorites. Suddenly, every family gathering included pointed questions about what I was planning to do for the other kids' eventual weddings, college graduations, and future milestones. I tried to address these concerns directly, having individual conversations with each of my children to explain my reasoning and reassure them that my love for Emma didn't diminish my feelings for their children. With Lisa, who lived in California and had always been the most level-headed of my 3 children, the conversation went smoothly. She understood that timing mattered, that Emma was getting married now and needed help now, and that there would be opportunities to help her daughter when the time came. With Michael, the conversation was more complex but ultimately positive. He appreciated my honesty about my finances and my motivations, and while he expressed some concern about family harmony, he supported my right to spend my money as I saw fit. With David, however, the conversation was a disaster. He accused me of favoritism, manipulation, and flaunting my wealth. He suggested that my gift to Emma was really an attempt to control the family and make myself look important. Most hurtfully, he questioned whether I was making sound financial decisions in my advancing age, implying that perhaps I wasn't capable of managing such large expenditures responsibly. That accusation stung more than all the others combined. At 73, I was sharper than most people half my age. I managed my own investments, balanced my own checkbook, and had successfully navigated the complex financial decisions that come with widowhood. The suggestion that I was some doddering old woman throwing money around carelessly was not just insulting, it was revealing of how David had come to see me. Sarah's campaign was more subtle, but equally damaging. She began having, quote, concerned conversations with Emma about the pressure of accepting such an expensive gift, the expectations that might come with it, and whether it was healthy for grandparents to be so involved in major life decisions. She couched these concerns in language about Emma's independence and maturity, but the underlying message was clear. Accepting Grandma's gift was a sign of weakness and immaturity. The manipulation was sophisticated and effective. Emma began second-guessing herself, calling me with anxious questions about whether the gift came with strings attached, whether I expected her to visit more often, or make different life choices in exchange for my generosity. These conversations broke my heart because they revealed how thoroughly Sarah had poisoned what should have been a simple expression of love between grandmother and granddaughter. I tried to reassure Emma repeatedly that my gift was unconditional, that I expected nothing in return except her happiness. But the damage was being done systematically, day by day, conversation by conversation. Sarah was turning my generosity into a burden and my love into a manipulation tactic. The situation reached a crisis point in early November, just 2 months before the wedding. Emma called me on a Thursday evening, crying so hard I could barely understand her words. Through her sobs, I pieced together what had happened. David and Sarah had staged what amounted to an intervention, telling Emma that accepting my gift was selfish and irresponsible, that it would create family discord, and that a mature woman should be able to pay for her own wedding. They'd presented her with an ultimatum: either scale back the wedding to something they could afford to pay for themselves, or deal with the family consequences of accepting my inappropriate gift. They'd made it clear that if she proceeded with the plaza reception, they would consider it a betrayal of family values and a rejection of their own efforts to provide for her. As I listened to Emma cry, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about money anymore, or even about a wedding. This was about respect, boundaries, and the right of a grandmother to love her granddaughter without interference. It was about Sarah's deep-seated resentment of my financial security and David's inability to separate his ego from his daughter's happiness. I made Emma a promise that night. "Sweetheart," I said, "you don't need to choose between your parents and your grandmother. You don't need to choose between family peace and your dream wedding. Just trust me, and let me handle this." I didn't tell her what I was planning to do. I didn't tell anyone, but as I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet house, surrounded by 45 years of family photographs and memories, I began to formulate a plan that would teach my family some hard lessons about respect, gratitude, and the consequences of taking love for granted. The wedding was still 3 months away. The deposits had been paid, the contracts signed, the vendors booked. Everything was in place for Emma's dream day, funded entirely by my careful savings and my desire to see my granddaughter happy. What happened next would change everything, but first I had some phone calls to make and some very careful decisions to consider. Because if there's one thing 73 years of life had taught me, it's that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who respect you the least. And sometimes, the most loving thing a grandmother can do is to stop enabling that disrespect. The November rain was beating against my kitchen windows as I sat with my morning coffee, thinking about what my late husband Robert would have advised in this situation. He'd always been the diplomatic one in our marriage, the peacemaker who could smooth over family conflicts with humor and wisdom. But Robert had also been fiercely protective of family dignity, and I knew he would never have tolerated the way our son and daughter-in-law were treating both Emma and me. The final straw came during Thanksgiving dinner, which I had volunteered to host as I had for the past 15 years. It seemed important to maintain traditions, especially during such a difficult time for the family. I'd spent days preparing, cooking all of Robert's favorite dishes, and setting the table with our good china, hoping that a beautiful meal in familiar surroundings might help heal some of the growing rifts. The day started well enough. Michael and his family arrived first, bringing their usual warmth and appreciation for the effort I'd put into the meal. Lisa had flown in from California with her daughter Sophie, and their presence always brought a lightness to family gatherings. Even David and Sarah arrived on time, though I noticed immediately that Emma looked strained and tired. It was during dessert that everything unraveled. I had just served my famous apple pie, the recipe that had been passed down from my own grandmother, when Sarah made an announcement that caught everyone off guard. "Since we're all together," she said, her voice carrying that artificial brightness that always preceded her most manipulative moments, "David and I wanted to share some exciting news about Emma's wedding plans." Emma's face went pale, and I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "We've decided to simplify things," Sarah continued, smiling at Emma with what looked like maternal pride, but felt like something much more sinister. "Emma has realized that she doesn't need all those expensive extras to have a beautiful wedding. We're going to have a lovely ceremony at our country club, followed by a reception in their smaller ballroom. Much more intimate and meaningful." The silence that followed was profound. I watched Emma's face, seeing the misery she was trying to hide behind a forced smile. This wasn't her decision. That much was clear from her body language and the way she avoided meeting my eyes. "What about the plaza?" Michael asked carefully, glancing between Emma and me. "Oh, we canceled all that," David said with satisfaction. "Much too extravagant for a young couple just starting out." Emma agrees that it's better to be practical. I set down my coffee cup very carefully, using the small action to control my rising anger. "Emma," I said quietly, "is this what you want?" Before she could answer, Sarah jumped in. "Of course it's what she wants." She's realized that accepting such an expensive gift would put unnecessary pressure on the relationship and set unrealistic expectations for the future. She wants to start her marriage with dignity and independence. The words were clearly rehearsed, and they made me sick. These people had systematically undermined my granddaughter's confidence, made her feel guilty for accepting love, and now they were forcing her to reject her dreams in the name of family harmony. I see, I said, maintaining my composure despite the fury building inside me. And the vendors? The deposits? That's all been handled, David said dismissively. We contacted everyone yesterday to cancel. There were some fees, but nothing we can't manage. That's when I understood the full scope of their manipulation. They hadn't just convinced Emma to change her mind. They had taken active steps to destroy the wedding I had planned for her, making decisions about contracts I had signed and deposits I had paid without even consulting me. The remainder of the dinner passed in strained conversation, with everyone tiptoeing around the obvious tension. Emma barely spoke, picking at her dessert and excusing herself early to help with dishes in the kitchen. When we were alone, she finally broke down. Grandma, I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. They said accepting your gift would hurt the family, that it would make me selfish and spoiled. They said you would think less of me if I couldn't pay for my own wedding, and that it wasn't fair to the other grandchildren. I held her while she cried, my own heart breaking for this sweet girl who had been manipulated into rejecting something that would have brought her joy. Sweetheart, I said softly. None of that is true. Not one word of it. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will support you. I don't know what I want anymore, she admitted. I'm so confused, and everyone has such strong opinions. Mom says the country club will be beautiful, and that I should be grateful they can afford that much. Dad says I need to learn to live within my means. But, Grandma, when I think about walking down the aisle at the country club instead of the plaza, I feel like I'm mourning something. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my living room surrounded by the detritus of Thanksgiving dinner and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to fight David and Sarah directly. That would only hurt Emma more. Instead, I was going to teach them a lesson about consequences, about what happens when you take a grandmother's love for granted and manipulate that love for your own petty purposes. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Eleanor Hartwell had been my attorney for 12 years. Ever since Robert's first heart scare made us realize we needed our estate planning updated. She was a formidable woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of sharp intelligence that made opposing counsel think twice before challenging her in court. More importantly, she understood family dynamics in a way that went beyond legal technicalities. Her office occupied the corner of a converted Victorian mansion in downtown White Plains, with tall windows that overlooked the courthouse square, and walls lined with law books that actually looked red rather than decorative. When I called that Friday morning after Thanksgiving, Eleanor's assistant somehow managed to squeeze me in between a estate dispute and a custody hearing. Bertha, Eleanor said, rising from behind her mahogany desk to greet me with the kind of firm handshake that spoke of decades in a male-dominated profession. I have to say, you sounded rather mysterious on the phone. Something about wedding contracts and family interference? I settled into one of her leather client chairs and began explaining the situation, starting with my decision to fund Emma's wedding and ending with the unauthorized cancellations that David and Sarah had made without consulting me. Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad in her precise handwriting. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, she said when I finished. You entered into contracts with various vendors as the primary party responsible for payment. Your son and daughter-in-law, who were not signatories to these contracts, contacted the vendors and attempted to cancel services that you had arranged and paid for. Is that accurate? Completely accurate, I confirmed. I have copies of all the contracts, and my name is on every single one as the responsible party. David and Sarah had no legal authority to make any changes. Eleanor's eyes lit up with the kind of professional enthusiasm that lawyers get when they encounter clear-cut legal violations. This is actually quite serious, Bertha. What they've done could constitute interference with contractual relations. And depending on the financial losses involved, it might even rise to the level of tortious interference. I'm not interested in suing my own family, I said quickly. That's not why I'm here. Of course not, Eleanor said, waving her hand dismissively. But understanding the legal framework gives us leverage. Now, what exactly do you want to accomplish here? I had thought about this question during the entire drive to her office, weighing my options and considering the potential consequences of each course of action. I want to teach them a lesson about respect, I said finally. I want them to understand that my generosity is a privilege, not a right, and that manipulating my granddaughter has consequences. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers in a gesture I recognized from our previous consultations. Tell me about the current status of the vendors and contracts. That's where it gets interesting, I said, pulling a folder from my purse. I started making phone calls yesterday to assess the damage. It turns out that while David and Sarah contacted the vendors, they didn't have the authority to actually cancel anything. Most of the vendors were confused by the calls and assumed it was some kind of misunderstanding. Smart vendors, Eleanor observed. They know better than to accept cancellation instructions from people who aren't parties to the contract. Exactly. So right now, everything is still technically in place. The plaza reservation, the catering, the flowers, the orchestra, everything. The vendors are waiting for clarification from me as the contracting party. Eleanor's smile was sharp and calculating. Which means you have options. You could proceed with the wedding as planned, you could legitimately cancel everything yourself, or you could do something more creative. What did you have in mind? Well, Eleanor said, pulling out a fresh legal pad, let's think about this strategically. Your son and daughter-in-law have essentially stolen your granddaughter's dream wedding through emotional manipulation. They've undermined your authority as the contracting party and attempted to interfere with legal agreements you made in good faith. The question is how to respond in a way that makes your point, without causing irreparable harm to family relationships. We spent the next hour discussing possibilities, legal implications, and potential consequences. Eleanor helped me understand exactly what rights I had as the contracting party and what obligations the vendors had to honor my decisions, rather than accepting instructions from unauthorized third parties. By the time I left her office, I had a plan. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't going to improve family harmony in the short term, but it would definitely teach David and Sarah that grandmother's money came with grandmother's rules. The first call I made was to Christine Morrison, the wedding planner I had hired to coordinate Emma's reception. Christine was a true professional who had been planning high-end events for over 20 years. And she had been as confused as anyone by the conflicting instructions she'd received from different family members. Mrs. Wilson, Christine said when I reached her at her office that Monday morning. I have to tell you, I've never experienced anything quite like this situation. I received calls on Friday from people claiming to be the bride's parents, insisting that everything needed to be canceled immediately. But when I explained that you were the contracting party and I needed written authorization from you, they became quite upset. I imagine they did, I said dryly. Christine, I need to ask you to disregard any instructions that don't come directly from me. I'm the one paying for this event, and I'm the only one with the authority to make changes. Understood completely, Christine said, with obvious relief. So are we proceeding as planned? For now, yes, but I may need to make some modifications in the coming days. Can you walk me through what it would take to change some of the details? Christine and I spent 45 minutes reviewing contingencies, discussing timeline flexibility, and exploring options I hadn't previously considered. By the end of our conversation, I had a much clearer understanding of exactly what was possible and how quickly changes could be implemented if necessary. My next call was to Marcus, Emma's fiancé. This was perhaps the most delicate conversation I needed to have, because Marcus was caught in the middle of a family drama that wasn't of his making. He was a genuinely nice young man who worked as a software engineer and seemed to truly adore Emma, but he was also conflict-averse and clearly overwhelmed by the dynamics swirling around his wedding. Mrs. Wilson, Marcus said when I reached him at his office, I'm really glad you called. Emma is beside herself about this whole situation, and honestly, I don't know what to do. I want her to be happy, but I also don't want to cause problems in your family. Marcus, I said gently, you're not causing problems in my family. The problems existed long before you came along. But I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. If money were no object, if family politics didn't matter, if you and Emma could have any wedding you wanted, what would that look like? There was a long pause before Marcus answered. It would look exactly like what you planned for us at the plaza, he said quietly. Emma showed me all the details. And Mrs. Wilson, I've never seen her eyes light up the way they did when she talked about that reception. She's been dreaming about it since she was a little girl, and I know she's heartbroken about having to give it up. And what about you? What do you want? I want Emma to be happy, Marcus said without hesitation. I don't care if we get married in a barn or a palace, as long as she's smiling when she walks down the aisle. But I have to tell you, the Emma I've been living with for the past week isn't smiling about anything. I understand. Marcus, I'm going to ask you to trust me for the next few days. There may be some family drama, and people may try to involve you in discussions about the wedding plans. Can you just tell them that you're leaving all the decisions to Emma and that you'll support whatever makes her happiest? I can do that, Marcus agreed. Mrs. Wilson, are you planning something? I'm planning to make sure my granddaughter gets the wedding she deserves, I said. That's all you need to know for now. After I hung up with Marcus, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the nuclear option Eleanor had outlined during our meeting. It was risky, potentially devastating to family relationships, and would certainly cause immediate pain for several people I loved. But it would also send an unmistakable message about respect, boundaries, and the consequences of manipulation. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that half measures wouldn't work. David and Sarah had escalated this conflict far beyond normal family disagreements. They had involved vendors, manipulated Emma's emotions, and tried to override my legal authority as the contracting party. A gentle response would only encourage them to push harder the next time they disagreed with my decisions. That evening, I called Emma and asked her to come over for dinner the following night. I told her I wanted to discuss the wedding situation calmly and privately, without the pressure of other family members weighing in. She agreed immediately, and I could hear the relief in her voice at the prospect of a conversation that didn't involve taking sides or defending her choices. Emma arrived at my house Tuesday evening looking tired and stressed, wearing the kind of casual clothes that suggested she was spending more time crying than caring about her appearance. I had prepared her favorite meal, herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables, and set the table in the breakfast nook where we'd had so many heart-to-heart conversations over the years. Grandma, Emma said as soon as she sat down, I need to apologize for this whole mess. I never meant for my wedding to cause so much trouble in the family. Stop right there, I said firmly. You have nothing to apologize for. Wanting a beautiful wedding is not a character flaw, and accepting a generous gift from someone who loves you is not a moral failing. The trouble in this family has nothing to do with you and everything to do with people who have forgotten how to behave with grace and gratitude. Emma's eyes filled with tears. But Mom says I'm being selfish, and Dad says I'm setting a bad example for my cousins. They keep talking about family values and being practical, and I'm starting to think maybe they're right. Emma, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand, let me tell you something about family values. A family that truly values each other supports dreams rather than crushing them. A family that understands love doesn't turn generosity into a weapon. And a family that practices real values doesn't manipulate a young woman into rejecting something that would make her happy. But what about fairness to the other grandchildren? What about it? When your cousin Jake graduates from college next year, do you think I should refuse to help with his student loans because it wouldn't be fair to you? When Sophie needs orthodontic work, should your Aunt Lisa tell her no because I already spent money on your wedding? Emma looked confused. Of course not. That would be ridiculous. Exactly. Love isn't a finite resource that gets depleted when you share it. Money, when you're fortunate enough to have it, is meant to be used for the people and causes you care about. The idea that helping you somehow hurts your cousins is manipulative nonsense designed to make you feel guilty for accepting love. We talked for over 2 hours, and gradually I watched Emma's natural confidence begin to resurface. She told me about the pressure she'd been under, the daily conversations with her parents about responsibility and realistic expectations, and the growing certainty that she was somehow failing as a daughter and granddaughter by wanting something beautiful for her wedding day. What would make you truly happy? I asked as we finished our dessert. The plaza, she said without hesitation. The reception you planned, with the orchestra and the flowers and all the details we talked about. That's what I dream about, Grandma. That's what I've always wanted. Then that's what you should have. But my parents. Your parents will adjust, I said firmly. Emma, you're 26 years old. You're getting married, starting your own family, beginning your own life. At some point, you have to stop letting other people's fears and insecurities dictate your choices. What if they don't come to the wedding? It was a devastating question, and one I'd been dreading. Then they'll miss one of the most beautiful days of your life, and they'll have to live with that choice. But Emma, I don't think it will come to that. When people see that their manipulation tactics aren't working, they usually find a way to accept reality. After Emma left that night, I sat in my living room and made the final decision about my course of action. I was going to proceed with the plaza reception exactly as planned, regardless of David and Sarah's objections. But I was also going to make sure they understood the full implications of their behavior. The next morning, I called Eleanor and asked her to draft a letter, not a threatening legal document, but a clear professional communication that established boundaries and expectations. I want them to understand, I told Eleanor, that their behavior has consequences, that attempting to interfere with my legal contracts is unacceptable, and that if they continue to manipulate Emma or undermine my relationship with her, they'll find themselves dealing with a grandmother who's much less accommodating than they've assumed. Eleanor laughed. Bertha, I've been waiting 12 years to see you get properly angry. This is going to be interesting. The letter Eleanor drafted was a masterpiece of legal courtesy wrapped around a core of absolute steel. It outlined the facts of the situation clearly and unemotionally. It explained that any future attempts to cancel or modify contracts I had entered into would be considered tortious interference and would be met with appropriate legal action. It established that Emma, as an adult, had the right to make her own decisions about her wedding without coercion or manipulation from family members. Most importantly, it made clear that my financial support for Emma's wedding was unconditional and irrevocable, and that any family member who attempted to pressure her into rejecting that support would find themselves excluded from future family gatherings hosted or funded by me. I hand-delivered copies to David and Sarah's house on Thursday evening, leaving the envelope in their mailbox without ringing the doorbell. I also sent copies to Michael and Lisa, along with explanatory notes that outlined my position and asked for their support in maintaining family peace. The response was swift and furious. David called me within 2 hours of finding the letter, his voice shaking with anger and indignation. "Mom, what the hell is this?" he demanded. "Are you threatening to sue us? Over what? Trying to help our daughter make responsible decisions?" "David," I said calmly, "you didn't try to help Emma make responsible decisions. You manipulated her into rejecting something that would have made her happy, and you attempted to cancel contracts that you had no legal authority to modify. That's not parenting, that's control. We're her parents. We have the right to guide her choices. You have the right to offer advice," I corrected. "You don't have the right to emotional manipulation, and you certainly don't have the right to interfere with legal agreements I've made. This is insane, Mom. You're choosing Emma over your own son. I'm not choosing anyone over anyone else. I'm establishing boundaries that should have been established a long time ago. Emma is getting the wedding reception I promised her, and your approval is not required." The conversation deteriorated from there, with David making increasingly desperate arguments about family hierarchy, parental authority, and my supposed mental decline. I listened patiently until he ran out of steam, then delivered the message I'd been preparing for weeks. "David," I said quietly, "I love you. I've loved you since the moment you were born, and I'll love you until the day I die. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespectful behavior, and it doesn't mean allowing you to hurt other people I care about. Emma is getting married at the plaza in January, and you can choose to celebrate that with us, or you can choose to sulk about it, but you cannot choose to prevent it. And if we don't come to the wedding, then you'll miss your daughter's wedding day, and she'll spend the rest of her life knowing that your ego was more important to you than her happiness." The silence that followed was long and painful. Finally, David said, "Mom, I think you need to talk to someone. This isn't like you." "You're right," I agreed. "The old me would have backed down to keep the peace. The old me would have prioritized your comfort over Emma's dreams. But David, the old me died with your father, and the woman who's left doesn't have time for games." After I hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Robert's favorite chair, thinking about the conversation and wondering if I'd made the right choice. The house felt empty and quiet, filled with the ghosts of happier family gatherings and the echoes of laughter that seemed increasingly distant. But then I thought about Emma's face when she'd described her dream wedding, and about the tears in her eyes when she'd tried to apologize for wanting something beautiful. I thought about the systematic campaign of guilt and manipulation that David and Sarah had waged against a young woman whose only crime was accepting love from her grandmother. Most of all, I thought about Robert and what he would have said about this situation. Robert, who had taught our children to dream big and work hard for those dreams. Robert, who had believed that family meant supporting each other's happiness, not tearing each other down out of petty jealousy or wounded pride. I knew without a doubt that Robert would have supported my decision. He would have been proud of me for standing up to bullies, even when those bullies happened to be our own son and daughter-in-law. The next few days brought a series of phone calls from various family members, each trying to broker some kind of compromise that would satisfy everyone involved. Michael called to express cautious support for my position, while urging me to find a way to repair the relationship with David. Lisa called from California to get the full story and ended up laughing at what she called David's epic tantrum over losing control of the situation. The most surprising call came from my sister Margaret, who lived in Florida and typically stayed out of family drama. Margaret was 2 years older than me and had always been the more diplomatic of the two of us, so I was expecting her to urge caution and compromise. Instead, she said, "Bertha, it's about damn time you stopped letting those two walk all over you. I've been watching Sarah manipulate that family for 20 years, and David's too weak to stand up to her. Good for you for drawing a line in the sand." "You really think I'm doing the right thing?" "I think you're doing the necessary thing," Margaret said firmly. "Sometimes love requires boundaries, and sometimes grandmothers have to remind their adult children how to behave like decent human beings." By the following Monday, exactly 1 week after I delivered Eleanor's letter, the battle lines had been drawn clearly. David and Sarah were refusing to discuss the wedding and had apparently forbidden Emma from mentioning it in their presence. Michael and his family were staying carefully neutral while expressing private support for my position. Lisa was flying in from California specifically to attend the wedding and show her support. Most importantly, Emma was beginning to reclaim her excitement about the upcoming celebration. She called me Tuesday evening with the kind of breathless enthusiasm I hadn't heard from her in months. "Grandma," she said, "I talked to Christine today about the final details, and everything sounds absolutely perfect. The flowers, the music, the menu, everything. I can't believe it's really going to happen." "It's really going to happen," I assured her. "And it's going to be exactly what you've always dreamed of. What if my parents don't come?" It was a question she asked every time we talked, and each time it broke my heart a little more. "Emma," I said gently, "that's their choice to make. But sweetheart, you can't control other people's decisions. You can only control your own response to them. I just wish things could be different." "I know, darling. But sometimes conflict is the price we pay for standing up for what's right. And what's right is for you to have the wedding you want, surrounded by people who celebrate your happiness instead of trying to diminish it." After we hung up, I realized that we were approaching the final phase of this family drama. The wedding was still 6 weeks away, but the fundamental positions had been established, and the consequences were becoming clear. David and Sarah had chosen their hill to die on, and I had chosen mine. The question now was whether they would find a way to climb down from their position before they missed one of the most important days in their daughter's life. I hoped they would, for Emma's sake and for their own, but I was no longer willing to compromise my granddaughter's happiness to accommodate their pride. The real test would come in the next few weeks, as the wedding date approached and the reality of their choices became undeniable. Because while I had won the battle over the wedding venue and the reception details, the war for family harmony was far from over, and I was beginning to suspect that the final confrontation was still to come. December arrived with an early snowfall that blanketed Westchester County in pristine white, transforming my garden into something from a fairy tale. I stood at my kitchen window watching the cardinals brave the cold at my bird feeder, their red feathers brilliant against the snow-covered branches, and thought about how deceptive peaceful moments could be. Because while my world looked serene from the outside, The Wilson family was about to enter its most turbulent period in decades. The first sign that David and Sarah were escalating their campaign came through Emma's cousin Jake, Michael's 17-year-old son, who had always been close to Emma, despite their age difference. Jake called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with the kind of anger that only teenagers can muster when confronted with adult hypocrisy. "Grandma Bertha," he said without preamble, "I need to tell you what Aunt Sarah said to my mom today." Jake went on to explain that Sarah had called Michael's wife Jennifer with what she described as concerns about the family dynamic. According to Jake, who had overheard the conversation from the next room, Sarah had suggested that my obvious favoritism toward Emma was creating unfair expectations among the other grandchildren, and that perhaps the extended family needed to have a serious conversation about my decision-making process. "She said you were being manipulated by Emma into spending money you couldn't afford," Jake continued, his voice rising with indignation. "And she suggested that maybe you weren't thinking clearly since Grandpa died. Mom told her she was out of line, but Grandma, she's calling other people too." I thanked Jake for the information and assured him that I could handle Sarah's gossip campaign, but privately I was disturbed by this development. It was one thing for David and Sarah to disagree with my decision within our immediate family, but quite another for them to spread doubts about my mental competence to the extended family. The next morning, I called Eleanor and described this new development. Her response was swift and decisive. "Bertha, this is potentially serious," she said. "If Sarah is questioning your mental capacity to make financial decisions, she might be laying groundwork for a legal challenge to your autonomy. We need to get ahead of this immediately." Eleanor arranged for me to undergo a comprehensive mental health evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist she knew and trusted. Dr. Rebecca Chen was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, who specialized in capacity assessments for elderly clients facing family disputes over financial decisions. The evaluation took place in Dr. Chen's comfortable office near the medical center and involved several hours of cognitive testing, memory assessments, and detailed discussions about my recent decisions and their rationale. Dr. Chen was thorough but kind, asking probing questions about my motivations for funding Emma's wedding, while carefully avoiding any suggestion that those motivations were questionable. "Mrs. Wilson," Dr. Chen said as we concluded our final session, "I want to be very clear about my findings. You demonstrate excellent cognitive function, clear reasoning ability, and complete understanding of the financial and emotional implications of your decisions regarding your granddaughter's wedding. There is absolutely no evidence of diminished capacity or impaired judgment. And you'll put that in writing? I'll provide a comprehensive report that Eleanor can use if anyone attempts to challenge your competency," Dr. Chen confirmed. "But Mrs. Wilson, I hope it doesn't come to that. Family disputes over money can become very ugly very quickly." Armed with Dr. Chen's report, I felt more confident about facing whatever Sarah might be planning. But I also realized that the situation was spiraling beyond a simple disagreement about wedding expenses. This was becoming a fundamental battle over respect, autonomy, and the right of an elderly woman to make her own choices about her own money. The battle moved to a new front the following week when I received an unexpected visit from Father McKenna, the priest who had married Robert and me 45 years earlier and who had officiated at both of my sons' weddings. Father McKenna was in his 70s now, with white hair and the kind of gentle manner that made him a natural mediator for family conflicts. "Bertha," he said when I invited him into my living room for tea, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. Sarah asked me to have a conversation with you about the wedding situation." I set down my teacup carefully, using the moment to control my initial flash of anger. "Did she now? And what exactly did Sarah tell you about the situation?" Father McKenna looked uncomfortable, clearly realizing he had stepped into more complicated territory than he'd anticipated. "She expressed concern that family harmony was being damaged by disagreements over Emma's wedding plans. She suggested that perhaps a neutral party might help everyone find common ground." "Father," I said gently, "I have tremendous respect for you, and I appreciate your desire to help heal family rifts. But I need you to understand that this isn't a disagreement between equals. This is a situation where my son and daughter-in-law have attempted to override my legal authority as a contracting party and have manipulated my granddaughter into rejecting a generous gift." I spent the next hour giving Father McKenna the complete story, including details about the unauthorized cancellation attempts and the systematic campaign to make Emma feel guilty for accepting my generosity. I showed him copies of the contracts I had signed and Eleanor's letter establishing my legal position. By the time I finished, Father McKenna looked deeply troubled. Bertha, I had no idea the situation was this complex. Sarah presented it as a simple case of differing opinions about appropriate wedding expenses. I'm not surprised, I said dryly. Sarah has become very skilled at presenting herself as the reasonable party in situations where she's actually the primary aggressor. What can I do to help? You can pray for wisdom and healing for this family, I said. And if anyone else approaches you with concerns about my mental state or my financial decisions, you can remind them that making judgments about situations they don't fully understand is neither Christian nor helpful. Father McKenna agreed, but I could see that he was struggling with the competing loyalties and versions of events he was hearing. After he left, I realized that Sarah's campaign was more sophisticated than I had initially understood. She wasn't just spreading gossip. She was systematically building a case that I was an unstable elderly woman making poor decisions, and she was using respected community figures to legitimize her concerns. That evening, I called my oldest friend, Dorothy Kramer, who had been my neighbor for 30 years before moving to a retirement community in Connecticut. Dorothy was sharper than most people half her age, and had always been an excellent judge of character. Dorothy, I said after we'd caught up on general news, I need to ask you something important. If someone told you I was showing signs of mental decline or making questionable financial decisions, what would you think? Dorothy snorted with laughter. I'd think they were either lying or delusional. Bertha, you're one of the most mentally sharp people I know, at any age. Why would someone say such a thing? I explained the situation, and Dorothy's response was characteristically blunt. That daughter-in-law of yours has always been a manipulative little snake, she said. I remember when David first brought her around. She spent the whole evening calculating the value of everything in your house and asking pointed questions about your insurance policies. You never told me that. You were so happy that David had found someone, and she was on her best behavior around you. But Bertha, I saw how she looked at your jewelry and your artwork. That woman has been planning for your money since the day she met your son. Dorothy's blunt assessment crystallized something I had been trying not to acknowledge. This wasn't really about Emma's wedding, or family values, or appropriate financial boundaries. This was about Sarah's long-term financial expectations, and her fury at discovering that I intended to spend my money on my own priorities, rather than preserving it for her eventual inheritance. The realization was both clarifying and deeply painful. I had spent 22 years trying to build a relationship with Sarah, making excuses for her coldness and attributing her behavior to shyness or insecurity. Now I understood that her behavior had always been calculated, designed to position herself as the dutiful daughter-in-law who deserved to benefit from my financial security. Armed with this new understanding, I began to see Sarah's recent actions in a different light. The unauthorized cancellation attempts weren't just about controlling Emma's wedding. They were about establishing Sarah's authority over my financial decisions. The gossip campaign about my mental state wasn't just about family harmony. It was about laying groundwork for potential legal challenges to my autonomy. Most disturbingly, the pressure on Emma to reject my gift wasn't just about wedding appropriateness. It was about ensuring that my money remained available for Sarah's family rather than being wasted on what she considered frivolous expenses. This realization changed my entire approach to the conflict. I was no longer dealing with a well-meaning but misguided daughter-in-law who simply disagreed with my priorities. I was dealing with someone who viewed my financial resources as her rightful inheritance, and who was willing to destroy family relationships to protect those resources. The next phase of Sarah's campaign began just before Christmas, when she organized what she called a family intervention at Michael's house. She had convinced Michael and Jennifer that I needed help processing my grief and making better decisions about my finances, and she had even enlisted the support of my daughter Lisa, who was flying in from California specifically for this confrontation. I learned about the planned intervention from Jennifer, who called me on Christmas Eve with obvious reluctance and discomfort. Bertha, Jennifer said, I need to tell you about something that's happening tomorrow, and I want you to know that Michael and I are not comfortable with it, but we feel trapped in the middle. Jennifer explained that Sarah had convinced the family that I was making impulsive financial decisions based on emotional manipulation from Emma, and that everyone needed to come together to help me see reason. The plan was for the entire family to gather at Michael's house on Christmas Day, for what Sarah described as a, quote, loving intervention, designed to help me understand the negative impact my decisions were having on family relationships. She's told everyone that you've been showing signs of confusion, and that the stress of Robert's death has affected your judgment, Jennifer continued. Lisa is very concerned because Sarah has been calling her regularly with updates about your behavior, and she's convinced that you need professional help. And what do you and Michael think? We think Sarah is manipulating the situation to serve her own purposes, Jennifer said bluntly. But Bertha, she's been very convincing, and she's got people genuinely worried about you. I thanked Jennifer for the warning and spent Christmas evening preparing for what was likely to be the most unpleasant Christmas day of my life. I called Eleanor and briefed her on the situation, asking her to be available by phone if I needed legal support during the confrontation. I also called Dr. Chen and asked if she could provide me with a copy of her evaluation report to bring to the family meeting. She agreed immediately and arranged for her office to email me a comprehensive document that clearly established my mental competency and decision-making capacity. Christmas morning dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind that made the house feel even emptier than usual. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit and pearl necklace, wanting to look dignified and competent for whatever confrontation awaited me at Michael's house. When I arrived at Michael's Colonial in Scarsdale, I could see immediately that this was not going to be a normal family Christmas. Instead of the usual chaos of wrapping paper and excited grandchildren, the living room had been arranged like a conference room, with chairs positioned in a semicircle facing a single chair that was obviously intended for me. Lisa greeted me with a hug that felt stilted and uncomfortable, her eyes searching my face as if looking for signs of the confusion Sarah had described. Michael looked apologetic and angry, while Jennifer busied herself in the kitchen to avoid the tension in the living room. David and Sarah arrived with Emma and Marcus, who looked bewildered and uncomfortable. Emma immediately came to my side, whispering that she had no idea what was happening and that her parents had insisted she attend this family meeting without explaining its purpose. Sarah took charge of the proceedings with the kind of organized efficiency that would have been admirable in other circumstances. She had prepared an agenda, printed copies of what she called concerning behaviors she had observed, and even brought a folder of brochures about eldercare services and financial management programs for seniors. Bertha, Sarah began, her voice dripping with false concern, we've all come together today because we love you, and we're worried about some of the decisions you've been making lately. We think the stress of losing Robert has affected your judgment, and we want to help you get the support you need. For the next hour, I sat quietly while my family discussed me as if I weren't in the room. Sarah presented her case systematically, describing my impulsive decision to fund Emma's wedding, my aggressive response to their concerns, and my inappropriate involvement of lawyers in what should have been a private family matter. Lisa, who had been primed by months of Sarah's careful manipulation, expressed genuine concern about my emotional state and suggested that I might benefit from grief counseling and financial management assistance. Michael tried to present a balanced perspective, but clearly felt pressure to support his brother's wife. David's contribution was perhaps the most hurtful, as he described feeling shut out of important family decisions, and suggested that my recent behavior was unlike the mother he'd always known. Throughout this ordeal, Emma sat beside me growing increasingly agitated, while Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. Finally, Emma couldn't contain herself any longer. "Stop it," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "All of you, just stop it. Grandma isn't confused or manipulated, or making bad decisions. She's being generous and loving, and you're all making her feel like she's done something wrong for wanting to give me a beautiful wedding." Sarah turned on Emma immediately. "Emma, this is exactly what we're talking about. You've been manipulated into thinking that accepting such an enormous gift is appropriate, and you can't see how it's affecting the family dynamic. The only thing affecting the family dynamic is your jealousy." Emma shot back. "You can't stand that Grandma has her own money and her own opinions, and you're trying to make everyone think she's incompetent because she won't let you control her." The room erupted in competing voices, with David demanding that Emma apologize to her mother, Michael trying to restore order, and Lisa looking increasingly confused about what was really happening. That's when I decided I'd heard enough. I stood up slowly, pulled Dr. Chen's evaluation report from my purse, and placed it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. I've listened to all of your concerns, I said quietly, and now I'm going to respond. First, I am not confused, impaired, or incompetent. This document is a comprehensive mental health evaluation conducted by a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in capacity assessments. It confirms that I am fully capable of making my own financial and personal decisions. I let that information sink in before continuing. Second, I am not being manipulated by Emma or anyone else. I chose to fund her wedding because I wanted to give her something beautiful, and because I have the financial means to do so without jeopardizing my own security. Sarah tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand and continued. Third, my response to your interference has not been aggressive or inappropriate. When you attempted to cancel contracts that I had signed and paid for, I consulted with my attorney to understand my legal rights. That's what any rational person would do when facing contractual interference. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member. Now I have some things to say to each of you. Lisa, you live 3,000 miles away and get most of your information about my life from Sarah's phone calls. Before you agree that I need professional help, perhaps you should consider whether your source of information might have her own agenda. Lisa looked stricken, clearly beginning to realize that she had been manipulated into participating in this intervention. Michael and Jennifer, I appreciate that you're trying to stay neutral, but there comes a point where neutrality becomes complicity. When someone is spreading false information about a family member's mental capacity, choosing not to take sides is actually choosing the side of the person spreading the lies. Michael nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that he was reevaluating everything he thought he understood about the situation. David, I continued, turning to my younger son, you are my child, and I will always love you. But you are also a 48-year-old man who should be capable of making decisions independent of your wife's manipulation. Your daughter is getting married in 3 weeks, and you have a choice to make about whether you want to be part of her joy or part of her pain. Finally, I turned to Sarah, who was sitting rigidly in her chair with an expression of barely controlled fury. And Sarah, I want to thank you for organizing this intervention. It's been very educational. I now understand exactly what you think of me, exactly how far you're willing to go to control my decisions, and exactly what kind of person you really are. Sarah's mask of concern finally slipped completely. You're a selfish old woman who's trying to buy affection, she snapped. You think throwing money around makes you important, but all you're doing is spoiling Emma and making the rest of us look bad? There it is, I said calmly. The truth finally comes out. This isn't about my mental capacity, or Emma's best interests, or family harmony. This is about your belief that my money should be preserved for your benefit rather than spent on my priorities. The silence that followed was deafening. Even David looked shocked by his wife's outburst, while Emma stared at her mother with an expression of dawning understanding. Sarah, I continued, you've spent 22 years calculating the value of my possessions and planning for my inheritance. You've manipulated family situations to position yourself as the dutiful daughter-in-law who deserves to benefit from my financial security. And now you're furious to discover that I intend to spend my money on my own terms rather than preserving it for your comfort. Sarah started to protest, but I wasn't finished. You've attempted to turn my family against me, questioned my mental capacity to community leaders, and emotionally abused my granddaughter to serve your own financial interests. You've crossed lines that can't be uncrossed, Sarah, and there will be consequences. I gathered my purse and coat, then turned to address the room one final time. Emma's wedding reception is happening at the Plaza Hotel on January 15th, exactly as planned. Everyone in this room is invited to attend and celebrate with us. But understand that your attendance is not required. It's a privilege that can be revoked if this harassment continues. As I reached the door, I turned back to deliver my final message. Oh, and Sarah? Since you're so concerned about my financial decisions, you should know that I've decided to revise my estate plan. My attorney will be in touch with details, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. The money you've been counting on for your retirement? It's going to charity. All of it. The last thing I heard as I left Michael's house was Sarah's voice rising in what sounded like genuine panic, followed by David's confused questions and Emma's shocked laughter. I drove home through the gray December afternoon feeling lighter than I had in months. The intervention had backfired spectacularly, exposing Sarah's true motivations and showing the rest of the family exactly what kind of person they'd been enabling. But more importantly, it had freed me from any lingering guilt about my decision to fund Emma's wedding. These people didn't deserve my consideration or my money, and they certainly didn't deserve to control my choices through emotional manipulation and false concerns about my competency. That evening, I called Eleanor and asked her to begin drafting a new will that would leave the bulk of my estate to charitable organizations focused on supporting elderly women's independence and family literacy programs. I also asked her to establish a trust fund for Emma that would be completely beyond Sarah's reach or influence. The war for control of my life and my money was far from over, but after the Christmas Day intervention, the battle lines had been drawn clearly. And for the first time since this conflict began, I was absolutely certain that I was on the right side. 3 weeks until Emma's wedding. 3 weeks for my family to decide whether they wanted to be part of the celebration or part of the casualty list. I was betting that when the music started and the champagne was poured, most of them would find a way to swallow their pride and show up. But if they didn't, Emma would still have her dream wedding, and I would still have my dignity. And Sarah would have learned a very expensive lesson about the consequences of trying to manipulate a grandmother who had nothing left to lose. The 2 weeks following my Christmas Day declaration passed in a strange bubble of calm that felt distinctly like the eye of a hurricane. I knew the storm wasn't over, but for the first time in months, I felt completely in control of my own life and decisions. Emma called me daily with wedding updates and barely contained excitement, while the rest of my family seemed to be holding their collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. My new estate plan became reality faster than I had anticipated. Eleanor worked with remarkable efficiency, and by New Year's Day, I had signed documents that would donate 85% of my assets to carefully selected charities upon my death. The remaining 15% would be divided equally among my 4 grandchildren through trusts that their parents could not access or control. The house would go to Emma specifically, ensuring that she would always have a place in Westchester County regardless of how family relationships evolved. I also established an immediate trust fund for Emma that would mature when she turned 30, providing her with financial independence that no family drama could threaten. The paperwork was filed with the county clerk's office, making my new estate plan a matter of public record that Sarah could research if she chose to torture herself with the details. The first indication that my message had been received came through Michael, who called me on January 2nd with a tone I had never heard from him before. A mixture of respect, concern, and something that might have been admiration. "Mom," he said carefully, "Jennifer and I wanted to talk to you about what happened on Christmas Day. We've had time to process everything, and we realize we owe you an apology." "Go on," I said, settling into my favorite chair with a cup of tea and the morning crossword puzzle. We should have recognized what Sarah was doing, long before it escalated to that intervention. Looking back, it's obvious that she was manipulating information and playing family members against each other. We should have stood up for you instead of trying to stay neutral. "And what brought you to this realization?" Michael sighed deeply. "Emma came to see us last week and told us some things we didn't know. About the pressure her parents had been putting on her. About the guilt trips and the emotional manipulation. Mom, we had no idea how bad it had gotten. Emma is a remarkable young woman," I said. "She's been handling more pressure than anyone her age should have to deal with. We want to make sure you know that we support your decision to fund her wedding, and we'll be there on January 15th to celebrate with her. Jennifer is even planning to help with some of the last-minute coordination if Emma needs assistance." "I appreciate that, Michael. And Michael? The estate plan changes I mentioned on Christmas Day are final and legal. I wanted you to hear that from me directly so there are no surprises later." There was a long pause before Michael responded. "Mom, I hope you know that Jennifer and I never expected or wanted an inheritance. We've built our own life and our own financial security. But are you sure this is the right way to handle things?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. "This family has forgotten the difference between love and financial obligation. Maybe losing the expectation of inheritance will help them remember." Lisa called the next day from California, her voice thick with tears and apologies. She had spent the week after Christmas researching my financial capacity and had discovered that not only was I completely competent to make my own decisions, but that Sarah had been feeding her fabricated stories about my behavior for months. "Bertha, I am so ashamed of myself," Lisa said. "I should have known better than to take Sarah's word about your mental state without talking to you directly. I should have recognized her motivations and questioned her information. Lisa, you live across the country and you were working with limited information. Sarah is very skilled at manipulation, and she's had years to perfect her techniques. But I should have trusted my own knowledge of who you are instead of believing that losing Robert had somehow changed your fundamental character. You've always been the strongest, smartest woman I know, and one conversation with Sarah shouldn't have convinced me otherwise." Lisa went on to explain that she had confronted Sarah directly about the lies and distortions, leading to a heated argument that had ended with Sarah accusing the entire family of quote 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 quote. "She's lost control of the narrative," Lisa observed, "and she's panicking. But Bertha, I'm worried about what she might do next. Desperate people make dangerous choices." Lisa's warning proved prophetic. 3 days before the wedding, I received a registered letter from a law firm I had never heard of, containing a petition for emergency guardianship based on allegations of diminished mental capacity. Sarah had hired an attorney and was attempting to have me declared incompetent, using the wedding expenses as evidence of impaired judgment. I called Eleanor immediately, and her response was swift and decisive. "This is a frivolous petition filed by someone with no legal standing to challenge your capacity," she said after reviewing the documents. "Sarah isn't your daughter, she has no financial responsibility for your care, and she has no evidence of actual incompetency. But Bertha, we need to take this seriously, because even frivolous legal challenges can be disruptive and expensive." Eleanor filed an immediate response to the petition, including Dr. Chen's comprehensive evaluation and a detailed accounting of my financial assets and decision-making process. She also filed a counter-motion requesting sanctions against Sarah's attorney for filing a bad faith petition without proper evidence or standing. "The hearing is scheduled for the day after Emma's wedding," Eleanor explained. "Either Sarah is incredibly stupid, or she's hoping to disrupt the wedding by creating legal uncertainty about your capacity to make financial commitments. Can she actually prevent the wedding from happening? Not legally, no. You've already paid for everything, and the vendors have no reason to question your capacity to contract for services. But she might try to create enough doubt and chaos to make the wedding unpleasant for Emma." That afternoon, I received a call from Christine Morrison, the wedding planner, who sounded deeply concerned about a conversation she'd had with Emma's mother. "Mrs. Wilson," Christine said, "I received a very strange call from Mrs. Sarah Wilson today. She claimed to be calling on behalf of the family to inform me that there were questions about your legal capacity to pay for the wedding services. She suggested that I should contact your son David to confirm payment arrangements." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that my contract is with you, that you've already paid for all services in full, and that I don't discuss client arrangements with unauthorized third parties." But Mrs. Wilson, she was very insistent and seemed to be implying that the wedding might not happen as planned. I assured Christine that the wedding would proceed exactly as scheduled and asked her to refer any future calls from Sarah directly to Eleanor's office. But I realized that Sarah was escalating her efforts to sabotage Emma's wedding day, probably hoping to prove that my impulsive spending had created chaos and uncertainty. That evening, Emma called me in tears, having just endured what she described as the worst conversation of her life with her parents. "Grandma," Emma sobbed, "they told me that you're being sued for incompetency, and that the wedding might be canceled because you don't have the legal right to spend money on it. They said I need to accept reality and plan a backup ceremony at the country club, just in case." "Emma, listen to me very carefully," I said, using the firm but gentle tone I had perfected during 30 years of teaching teenagers. "Your wedding is happening at the Plaza Hotel on Saturday evening, exactly as planned. The legal petition your mother filed is frivolous and will be dismissed. But even if it weren't, it couldn't affect contracts that have already been executed and paid for." "But what if?" "No what ifs," I interrupted. Emma, you have spent months being manipulated and frightened by people who should be supporting and celebrating you. It stops now. You are going to have the wedding of your dreams, and you are going to be radiant and happy, and anyone who tries to steal that joy from you will have to go through me first. Emma's tears gradually subsided as I walked her through the legal realities and reassured her that everything was secure and protected. By the end of our conversation, she was laughing about the absurdity of the situation and making jokes about having the most dramatic pre-wedding week in family history. The next morning brought an unexpected ally in the form of Marcus's mother, Janet Crawford, who called to introduce herself and express her concern about the family turmoil surrounding the wedding. Mrs. Wilson, Janet said, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly. Marcus has told me about the difficulties your family has been experiencing, and I wanted you to know that his father and I completely support your generosity toward Emma and Marcus. Janet went on to explain that she and her husband had been following the family drama with growing amazement and disgust. As successful professionals who had funded their own children's education and weddings without drama or resentment, they couldn't understand Sarah's behavior or motivations. We've raised 4 children and helped with 5 weddings so far, Janet continued, and I can tell you that the most important thing is the happiness of the young couple. What you've done for Emma and Marcus is beautiful and generous, and anyone who can't see that is revealing their own character flaws. Janet also shared some information that Emma apparently hadn't felt comfortable telling me directly. Sarah had contacted Marcus's family multiple times, trying to enlist their support for scaling back the wedding, and suggesting that my gift was inappropriate and potentially fraudulent. We told her politely that we considered your gift to be between you and Emma, and that we were looking forward to celebrating at the plaza, Janet said. But Mrs. Wilson, she seemed genuinely shocked that we weren't concerned about the expense or the implications. I think she expected us to pressure Marcus into rejecting your generosity. That afternoon, I drove to the Plaza Hotel for the final walkthrough with Christine and Emma. The ballroom was even more beautiful than I had imagined, with crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across ivory linens and arrangements of white roses and baby's breath that looked like something from a fairy tale. Emma walked through the space with wonder, touching the place cards and examining the centerpieces with the kind of reverent joy that made every dollar I'd spent feel insignificant. Marcus followed behind her with an expression of quiet amazement, occasionally squeezing my hand and whispering, "Thank you," when Emma was distracted by some new detail. "Grandma," Emma said as we finished the walkthrough, "I need to tell you something important. Even if my parents don't come to the wedding, even if they never speak to me again, I will never regret accepting your gift. This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me, and I will remember it for the rest of my life." That evening, I received what would be the final communication from David before the wedding, a text message that simply said, "Mom, we'll be there tomorrow. Sarah isn't happy about it, but Emma is our daughter and we won't miss her wedding day." I didn't respond to the text, but I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Emma wouldn't have to deal with the pain of her parents' absence on her wedding day, and sadness that it had taken a legal threat and family intervention for David to remember his priorities. The morning of January 15th dawned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant winter sunshine that makes snow sparkle like diamonds. I woke early and spent an hour in my garden, bundled in Robert's old coat and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. I thought about Robert and how proud he would have been of Emma, how much he would have enjoyed the planning process and the celebration to come. I thought about the family we had built together and the way it had evolved and fractured over the years. Most of all, I thought about the lesson this experience had taught me about the difference between love and control, between generosity and manipulation. At 10 o'clock, Jennifer arrived to drive me to the plaza, having volunteered to serve as my escort and support system for the day. She brought coffee and croissants from my favorite bakery, along with a small gift box wrapped in silver paper. "This is from Michael and me," she said as I opened the box to reveal a delicate pearl bracelet. "We wanted you to have something beautiful to wear today, and we wanted you to know how proud we are of you for standing up for Emma and for yourself." The bracelet was perfect, simple enough to complement my navy dress, but elegant enough to acknowledge the significance of the occasion. As Jennifer helped me fasten the clasp, I realized that this might be the first piece of jewelry anyone had given me since Robert's death, and the thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to my eyes. We arrived at the plaza at noon, and I spent the afternoon in a suite overlooking Central Park, helping Emma with final preparations and watching her transform into the radiant bride she had always dreamed of becoming. Her dress was a masterpiece of silk and lace that had required 3 fittings to achieve perfection, and her veil had belonged to my mother, carefully preserved for 60 years for just this moment. Lisa arrived from California bearing a suitcase full of family photographs that she had arranged into a beautiful display for the reception. Michael and his family came early to help with logistics and moral support. Even Jake, now 18 and preparing for college, had put on a suit and appointed himself as my unofficial bodyguard for the evening. At 4 o'clock, David and Sarah arrived with the kind of stiff formality that suggested they were attending a business function rather than their daughter's wedding. Sarah was dressed in an elegant black dress that was either appropriate morning attire or a deliberate statement about her feelings regarding the event. The awkwardness of their arrival was immediately smoothed over by Emma, who greeted them with genuine warmth and gratitude for their presence. She had chosen to focus on their attendance rather than their reluctance, and her grace in that moment reminded me why she deserved every beautiful detail of this celebration. The ceremony itself was held in the hotel's chapel, with Father McKenna officiating despite the complications of recent weeks. Emma floated down the aisle on David's arm while Marcus waited at the altar with an expression of pure joy and disbelief. As I watched my granddaughter exchange vows with the man she loved, surrounded by flowers I had chosen and music I had arranged, I felt a profound sense of completion. This was what love looked like, not control or manipulation or conditional support, but the simple desire to create beauty and joy for someone you cherish. The reception that followed was everything Emma had dreamed of and more. The orchestra played perfectly, the food was exquisite, and the ballroom glowed with candlelight and laughter. Emma and Marcus danced their first dance to "The Way You Look Tonight," while 200 guests watched with the kind of collective happiness that makes wedding receptions magical. During the father-daughter dance, I watched David hold his daughter close and whisper something in her ear that made her laugh through happy tears. Whatever else had happened between us, he loved Emma, and seeing him embrace the joy of her wedding day reminded me that family relationships are complex enough to hold both love and disappointment simultaneously. Sarah remained stiff and uncomfortable throughout the evening, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary, and spending most of her time at a corner table with relatives who seemed unaware of the recent family drama. But even Sarah couldn't completely resist the magic of the evening, and I caught her smiling during the cake cutting and applauding when the orchestra played Emma's favorite song. The highlight of the evening came during the toasts, when Emma stood to thank everyone who had contributed to her perfect day. She spoke about love and family and the importance of people who believe in your dreams, even when others tried to diminish them. "Most especially," Emma said, raising her champagne glass in my direction, "I want to thank my grandmother, Bertha Wilson, who taught me that accepting love is not a weakness, and that some dreams are worth fighting for. Grandma, thank you for giving me the wedding of my dreams and for showing me what it means to be a strong woman who stands up for what she believes in." The applause that followed was thunderous, and I felt tears streaming down my face as Emma crossed the room to embrace me. In that moment, surrounded by music and laughter and the scent of roses, I knew that every difficult conversation and every moment of family tension had been worth it. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing alone on the hotel's terrace, looking out over the lights of Manhattan and thinking about the events that had brought us to this moment. The legal petition would be dismissed on Monday, the family relationships would slowly heal or permanently fracture, and Emma would begin her married life with beautiful memories of a wedding that honored her dreams. Marcus found me there as the orchestra played its final song, still in his tuxedo but with his bow tie hanging loose around his neck. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, joining me at the railing, "I wanted to thank you privately for everything you've done for Emma and for us. I know this hasn't been easy for you, and I want you to know that Emma and I will never forget your generosity or your courage." "Marcus," I said, putting my hand on his arm, "you make my granddaughter happy, and that's all I've ever wanted for her. Take care of each other, and don't let other people's opinions dictate your choices." As we stood there in comfortable silence, watching the city lights twinkle below, I reflected on the lessons of the past few months. I had learned that respect is earned through actions rather than inherited through relationships. I had discovered that love without boundaries isn't really love at all, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's destructive behavior. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that at 73 years old, I was still capable of fighting for what mattered and winning battles that younger people might have lost. The drive home that night was quiet and peaceful, with Jennifer handling the Manhattan traffic while I sat in the passenger seat, feeling the kind of bone-deep satisfaction that comes from completing a difficult task successfully. The wedding had been perfect, Emma had been radiant, and the family had managed to celebrate together, despite all the drama and dysfunction of recent weeks. When we reached my house in Westchester, Jennifer walked me to the door and waited while I disarmed the security system and turned on the lights. "Bertha," she said as I hung up my coat, "I hope you know that what you did tonight, what you've done for Emma throughout this whole ordeal, it's exactly what Robert would have wanted. You honored his memory and your values, and you gave Emma something she'll treasure forever." After Jennifer left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Robert's favorite chair, still wearing my navy dress and pearl bracelet, thinking about the evening and the battles that had led to it. The house felt different somehow, not empty the way it had for the past 3 years, but peaceful and complete. On Monday morning, Eleanor called with the expected news that Sarah's petition had been dismissed with prejudice, and that the judge had issued sanctions against her attorney for filing frivolous claims. The legal threat was over, but the family relationships would take longer to resolve. Emma and Marcus left for their honeymoon in Tuscany on Tuesday, sending me a photo from the Rome airport with a note that said, "Thank you for giving us the perfect start to our marriage. We love you, Grandma Bertha." Over the following weeks, the family slowly found its new equilibrium. Michael and Jennifer became regular visitors, often bringing their sons for dinner and conversation. Lisa called weekly from California and began planning a summer visit that would be longer than her usual brief stays. David remained distant but polite, apparently processing the events of recent months and trying to rebuild his relationship with Emma without completely rejecting Sarah's perspective. We exchanged pleasantries when necessary and avoided discussing the wedding or the legal drama. Sarah herself seemed to have retreated from family activities entirely, perhaps recognizing that her manipulation tactics had backfired spectacularly and left her isolated from the people she had tried to control. As spring arrived and I began working in my garden again, I realized that the wedding drama had accomplished something I hadn't expected. It had clarified my relationships and priorities in a way that felt liberating rather than tragic. I was no longer the accommodating grandmother who prioritized family peace over family values. I was no longer the widow who defined herself through other people's needs and expectations. I was Bertha Wilson, a woman who had fought for her granddaughter's dreams and won, who had stood up to bullies and manipulators and emerged with her dignity intact. The money I had spent on Emma's wedding was gone, invested in memories and meaning, rather than accumulating in accounts for other people's benefit. The money I had redirected to charity would serve causes I believed in, rather than enabling people who had forgotten the difference between love and entitlement. But most importantly, I had learned that being a grandmother didn't require being a pushover, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is teach your family that respect and gratitude aren't optional. Emma's wedding photos arrived in May, beautiful bound albums that captured every moment of her perfect day. I spent an afternoon arranging my favorites in frames throughout the house, replacing some of the older family photos with images that reflected the family I had chosen to prioritize. In the center of my mantelpiece, I placed a photo of Emma and me dancing together at the reception, both of us laughing with pure joy. Every time I looked at that photograph, I remembered why the battle had been worth fighting, and why some dreams are too important to sacrifice for the sake of keeping peace with people who don't understand the difference between love and control. 6 months later, when Emma called to tell me that she and Marcus were expecting their first child, I began planning my next act of grandmother love. Not because I had to prove anything to anyone, but because creating joy for the people you cherish is what love looks like when it's free from conditions and expectations. And if anyone in my family had a problem with that, they were welcome to take it up with my attorney. 1 year later, I stood in the same Plaza Hotel ballroom where Emma had danced her first dance as a married woman, But this time, I was attending a charity gala for the Westchester Women's Independence Foundation, an organization I had helped establish with part of my redirected inheritance funds. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was celebrating women's autonomy in the exact location where I had fought my own battle for respect and recognition. The foundation supported elderly women facing family financial manipulation, providing them with legal resources and advocacy services. In the 12 months since Emma's wedding, we had helped 43 women navigate guardianship challenges, estate disputes, and family interference with their financial decisions. Every case reminded me of my own experience with Sarah's manipulation and the legal petition that had tried to strip away my autonomy. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the geriatric psychiatrist who had evaluated my mental capacity, now served on our advisory board and had become an unexpected friend. She approached me during the cocktail hour, elegant in a midnight blue gown that complemented her silver hair. "Bertha," she said, raising her champagne glass in a private toast, "I've been thinking about your case lately. Do you realize that your refusal to be intimidated has probably inspired dozens of other women to stand up for themselves?" "I hope so," I replied, adjusting the emerald necklace that had belonged to my mother and thinking about the letters I received weekly from women who had read about the foundation in local newspapers. Though I have to admit, I never intended to become a poster child for grandmother rebellion. Dr. Chen laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we never plan to fight. Your willingness to endure family conflict to protect your granddaughter's happiness and your own autonomy sent a message that many women needed to hear." As if summoned by our conversation, Emma appeared at my elbow, radiant in a flowing coral dress that accommodated her 6-month pregnancy beautifully. She had insisted on attending the gala despite Marcus's concerns about her being on her feet for too long, claiming that supporting the foundation was too important to miss. "Grandma," Emma said, linking her arm through mine with the casual affection that had returned to our relationship once the wedding drama subsided. "Marcus and I have something to tell you, and we wanted to wait until tonight to share the news." I raised my eyebrows expectantly, noting the excitement barely contained in Emma's voice and the way Marcus hovering nearby with the photographer I recognized from their wedding. "We've decided on the baby's name," Emma continued, her voice thick with emotion. "If it's a girl, we're naming her Bertha Emma Crawford Wilson. We want our daughter to carry the name of the strongest woman we know." The announcement hit me like a physical blow, but in the best possible way. I felt tears spring to my eyes as the full meaning of their decision sank in. They weren't just honoring me with a name. They were making a statement about values, about the kind of strength they wanted to pass on to their child. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Bertha isn't exactly a fashionable name for a modern baby." "It's perfect," Marcus said, stepping forward to join our small circle. "We want our daughter to know that she comes from a line of women who don't back down when they believe in something important. And Grandma, we want her to understand that accepting love and generosity isn't weakness, it's wisdom." The photographer captured the moment when Emma hugged me, both of us crying with happiness while Dr. Chen and Marcus looked on with indulgent smiles. Later, when I saw the pictures, I would think about how different this celebration felt from the tense family gatherings that had preceded Emma's wedding. This joy was uncomplicated, unmanipulated, freely given and freely received. As the evening progressed, I found myself reflecting on the year that had passed since the wedding, and the ways my family relationships had evolved. Michael and Jennifer had become my closest allies, visiting regularly and including me in their son's activities with the kind of natural warmth that made me feel valued rather than tolerated. Their younger son, Tommy, had started joining me for gardening sessions on weekends, showing the same patience with plants that his grandfather Robert had possessed. Lisa had surprised everyone by deciding to relocate from California to Connecticut, taking early retirement from her consulting firm and purchasing a charming colonial house just 20 minutes from mine. She claimed the move was motivated by wanting to be closer to family as she entered her 60s, but I suspected that watching the wedding drama unfold had reminded her of how quickly family dynamics could shift and how important it was to invest in relationships while there was still time. The relationship with David remained complicated but slowly improving. He had reached out tentatively in the months following Emma's wedding, initially through awkward text messages asking about my health, and gradually progressing to occasional phone calls and even a few visits. We didn't discuss the wedding drama directly, but there was an underlying acknowledgement that mistakes had been made and that rebuilding trust would take time. Sarah, however, had become a ghost in our family structure. She attended necessary events like Emma's baby shower and holiday gatherings, but with the kind of brittle politeness that made everyone uncomfortable. She had never apologized for the intervention, the legal petition, or the months of manipulation that had preceded them. Instead, she seemed to have retreated into a shell of wounded pride and resentment that kept her isolated from the warmth that characterized our family's new dynamic. David's attempt to navigate between loyalty to his wife and love for his daughter had resulted in a kind of emotional compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain relationships with both, but prevented him from addressing the underlying issues that had created the conflict in the first place. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was functional, and sometimes functionality was the best outcome available in complicated family situations. The Foundation Gala concluded with a speech from our keynote speaker, a federal judge who had spent decades handling elder abuse cases and who spoke passionately about the importance of protecting elderly women's autonomy. As I listened to her words about dignity, respect, and the right to make one's own choices regardless of age, I thought about the women we had helped through the foundation and the battles they had fought in their own families. Margaret Kellerman, 78 years old, whose son had tried to have her declared incompetent when she decided to sell her house and move to an assisted living community that offered more social activities. The foundation had connected her with legal representation that successfully defended her right to make her own housing decisions. Dorothy Sinclair, 81, whose daughter-in-law had convinced her son to take control of her credit cards and bank accounts after she made a large donation to her church's building fund. We had helped her regain access to her own money and establish legal protections against future financial interference. Catherine Walsh, 75, whose entire family had turned against her when she decided to marry a widower she had met at her retirement community. The foundation had provided mediation services that helped her children understand that their mother's happiness was more important than their concerns about inheritance implications. Each case reinforced my belief that the battle I had fought over Emma's wedding was part of a much larger cultural problem. The assumption that elderly family members, particularly women, lose the right to autonomy and self-determination simply because they reach a certain age or experience major life changes like widowhood. The evening ended with dancing to a small orchestra that reminded me poignantly of Emma's wedding reception. I found myself on the dance floor with Jake, now a freshman at Columbia University, studying pre-law with the stated intention of specializing in elder rights advocacy. He had grown into a thoughtful young man whose outrage at his aunt's behavior had crystallized into a career path dedicated to protecting vulnerable elderly people from family manipulation. "Grandma Bertha," Jake said as we swayed to a gentle waltz, "I've been thinking about writing my senior thesis on legal protections for elderly autonomy. Would you be willing to let me interview you about your experience with the guardianship petition?" "I'd be honored," I replied, noting how tall he had grown and how much he resembled his grandfather Robert around the eyes. "But Jake, make sure you understand that my situation was unusual because I had financial resources and legal representation. Most elderly women facing family manipulation don't have those advantages." "That's exactly why the research is important," Jake said with the kind of passionate intensity that reminded me of myself at his age. "The legal system should protect everyone's autonomy, not just people who can afford good lawyers." As the gala concluded and guests began to leave, I realized that the evening had marked another kind of completion for me. The foundation was thriving, my family relationships had found a new equilibrium, and Emma's pregnancy promised the continuation of our family line with values I was proud to see passed down to the next generation. Driving home through the quiet streets of Westchester County, I thought about the phone call I had received earlier that week from Christine Morrison, the wedding planner who had coordinated Emma's reception. She had called to tell me about a new client, a grandmother who wanted to fund her granddaughter's wedding despite family opposition, and who had specifically requested Christine's services because she had heard about the beautiful event we had created together. "Mrs. Wilson," Christine had said, "I think you started something with Emma's wedding." I've had 3 inquiries in the past month from grandmothers who want to give their grandchildren dream weddings, despite family pressure to scale back. They all mention your story as inspiration for standing up to family manipulation. The idea that my private family battle had somehow become public inspiration was both humbling and slightly overwhelming. I had never intended to be a role model or to make a statement about grandmothers' rights. I had simply wanted to give Emma a beautiful wedding day and protect my own autonomy from people who thought they knew better than I did about my own life. But perhaps that was exactly why the story had resonated with other women. I hadn't set out to be heroic. I had just refused to be bullied. I hadn't planned to make a political statement. I had simply insisted on my right to spend my own money according to my own values. Sometimes the most powerful examples come from ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary determination. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Father McKenna, who arrived at my door with a plate of homemade cookies from his housekeeper, and a request that I wasn't quite prepared for. "Bertha," he said as we settled in my living room with coffee and the still warm cookies, "I've been approached by the Diocesan Marriage Preparation Program about developing a workshop on family financial boundaries. They want someone to speak to engaged couples about managing family expectations and protecting their autonomy as they start their married lives." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Father, I'm flattered, but I'm hardly qualified to give marriage advice. My experience was more about family warfare than family harmony." "That's exactly why you're qualified," Father McKenna said with a gentle smile. "Bertha, you demonstrated something that many young couples need to understand. That love doesn't require accepting inappropriate behavior from family members, and that healthy boundaries are essential for healthy relationships." He went on to explain that the marriage preparation program had been receiving increasing numbers of questions from engaged couples about handling family pressure regarding wedding expenses, guest lists, and reception details. Many young people were struggling with guilt about disappointing parents or grandparents who had different ideas about appropriate celebrations. "What you showed Emma," Father McKenna continued, "was that accepting generosity doesn't make her weak or spoiled, and that standing up for her dreams doesn't make her ungrateful. Those are lessons that many young people need to hear, especially young women who are often taught to prioritize other people's comfort over their own happiness." I agreed to consider the speaking opportunity, though I insisted on thinking about it carefully before making a commitment. The idea of sharing my story with strangers felt both empowering and terrifying, but I was beginning to understand that personal experiences often carry broader meanings that extend far beyond their original context. That afternoon, I called Eleanor to discuss the legal implications of speaking publicly about family financial disputes and elder autonomy issues. She was enthusiastic about the opportunity and assured me that sharing my experience couldn't create any additional legal vulnerabilities. "Bertha," Eleanor said, "you've become an inadvertent expert on a topic that many people need to understand better. The legal system is full of cases like yours. Elderly people whose families try to control their decisions through manipulation, intimidation, and frivolous legal challenges. Your willingness to fight back and win could help other people recognize their own rights and find the courage to defend them." Over the following weeks, I began to understand that the wedding drama had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. I was no longer the accommodating widow who prioritized peace over principle, but I also wasn't the bitter elderly woman who had let family conflict consume her life. Instead, I had become something I hadn't expected. A woman who understood the difference between being loved and being controlled, and who was willing to share that knowledge with others who might need it. Emma's baby shower took place on a warm Saturday in June, hosted at Michael and Jennifer's house with decorations in soft yellow and green, since she and Marcus had decided to keep the baby's gender a surprise. The gathering was small and intimate, including only family members and Emma's closest friends. But the atmosphere was filled with the kind of uncomplicated joy that had become characteristic of our family events, since the wedding drama had forced everyone to clarify their priorities. Sarah attended the shower, bringing a beautiful hand-knitted blanket that must have taken months to complete, and speaking politely to everyone present. But there was still an underlying tension in her presence, a sense that she was participating in family events out of obligation rather than genuine enthusiasm. She complimented the decorations, admired the gifts, and made appropriate conversation about the baby's due date. But she remained emotionally distant in a way that made her isolation from the family's warmth palpable. During the gift opening ceremony, Emma held up a small silver picture frame I had given her, designed to hold the baby's first photograph. The inscription read, "For baby Crawford Wilson, with love from great-grandmother Bertha," and Emma's eyes filled with tears as she read it aloud. "Grandma," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion, "I can't wait for this baby to know you and learn from you. I want our child to understand what real strength looks like and what it means to stand up for the people you love." The comment was clearly directed at the entire room, but I noticed that Sarah's expression tightened slightly, as if she understood that Emma's words carried implications about the kind of grandmother she wanted her child to emulate. It wasn't meant as a deliberate slight, but the contrast between my advocacy for Emma's happiness and Sarah's attempts to control it was too obvious to ignore. After the other guests had left, I stayed to help Jennifer clean up, and we found ourselves talking about the changes in family dynamics over the past year and a half. "Bertha," Jennifer said as we packed leftover cake into containers for people to take home, "I want you to know how much Michael and I have learned from watching you handle the wedding situation. We've started applying some of your boundary-setting techniques with our own extended family, and it's made a huge difference in reducing drama and manipulation." She went on to explain that Michael's sister had been pressuring them to loan money for her son's college expenses, using guilt and family obligation as leverage. Instead of automatically agreeing or creating family conflict by refusing, they had followed my example by setting clear boundaries, explaining their decision calmly, and refusing to engage with manipulative arguments. "We told her that we love her and want her son to succeed, but that we have our own financial priorities and obligations," Jennifer continued. "When she tried to make us feel guilty about having more money than she does, we simply repeated our position without getting defensive or angry. It worked, Bertha. The pressure stopped, and the relationship actually improved because she realized we weren't going to be manipulated." Stories like Jennifer's reinforced my growing understanding that the principles I had applied during the wedding drama were transferable to other family situations and other types of relationships. Standing up to manipulation, setting clear boundaries, and refusing to prioritize peace over principles weren't just strategies for dealing with wedding conflicts. They were fundamental life skills that many people needed to develop. Summer passed peacefully, with regular family gatherings, long conversations with Emma about her pregnancy and preparations for motherhood, and continuing work with the foundation to support other elderly women facing family manipulation. I also began meeting with Father McKenna and the diocesan marriage preparation team to develop the workshop content for engaged couples. The workshop materials we created focused on 3 key principles: the importance of establishing financial boundaries early in marriage, the difference between family input and family control, and the right of married couples to make their own decisions about their celebrations and traditions. We used case studies and role-playing exercises to help couples practice responding to family pressure with confidence and grace. My first workshop presentation took place in September, with 12 engaged couples gathered in the parish hall on a rainy Saturday morning. I had been nervous about sharing personal details with strangers, but the couples were so engaged and appreciative that my initial discomfort quickly disappeared. During the question and answer session, a young woman named Patricia raised her hand and asked, "Mrs. Wilson, how did you find the courage to stand up to your family when you knew it would create conflict?" "I'm struggling with similar pressure about my wedding, and I keep backing down because I hate confrontation." The question struck me as particularly important because it got to the heart of why so many people, especially women, accept inappropriate treatment from family members rather than fighting for their own happiness and autonomy. "Patricia," I said, "I think the key is understanding that avoiding confrontation today often means accepting a lifetime of inappropriate treatment. When I chose to fight for Emma's wedding and my own autonomy, I wasn't just protecting that one event. I was establishing principles that would govern all future family interactions." I went on to explain that confrontation isn't always negative, and that sometimes conflict is the price we pay for respect and healthy relationships. The couples seemed to find this perspective both challenging and liberating, and several of them approached me after the workshop to share their own stories about family pressure and manipulation. One couple, Maria and James, told me that Maria's mother had been pressuring them to have their reception at her country club, despite their preference for a more casual outdoor celebration. The mother was using financial contributions as leverage, threatening to withdraw support if they didn't accept her venue choice. After listening to your presentation, Maria said, I realize that my mother isn't really offering to help. She's trying to buy control over our wedding. James and I have decided to scale back our celebration and pay for it ourselves, rather than accept money that comes with strings attached. Conversations like this reinforced my belief that the principles I had learned through my own family drama could help other people navigate similar challenges more successfully. The workshop became so popular that Father McKenna asked me to present it quarterly, and requests began coming in from other parishes and community organizations. October brought Emma's due date and the arrival of my great-granddaughter, born on a crisp autumn morning with the kind of dramatic flair that seemed appropriate for a baby named after me. Bertha Emma Crawford Wilson weighed 7 pounds and 3 ounces, had her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin, and announced her arrival with lungs that could probably be heard throughout the maternity ward. I held her for the first time in the hospital room while Emma and Marcus looked on with the kind of exhausted happiness that new parents radiate, and I felt the profound joy that comes from witnessing the continuation of family love across generations. Hello, little Bertha, I whispered to the tiny girl who would carry my name into the future. You're going to be a force to be reckoned with, aren't you? The baby's christening took place 6 weeks later, with Father McKenna officiating and the entire extended family in attendance. Even Sarah seemed genuinely moved by the ceremony, holding her granddaughter with obvious love and speaking to me with more warmth than she had shown in over a year. She's beautiful, Bertha, Sarah said as we stood together after the service, watching Emma and Marcus pose for photographs with the baby. And Emma seems so happy and confident as a mother. She is, I agreed, noting that this was the first time Sarah had initiated a personal conversation with me since the Christmas Day intervention. Emma has grown into a remarkable woman, and I think motherhood is going to bring out even more of her strength and wisdom. Sarah nodded thoughtfully, and for a moment I wondered if she was beginning to understand that Emma's happiness and confidence were directly related to feeling supported and celebrated rather than controlled and criticized. But the moment passed without further comment, and Sarah returned to her usual polite distance. The first Christmas with baby Bertha was magical in ways I hadn't anticipated. Emma and Marcus hosted dinner at their apartment, with the baby sleeping peacefully in a bassinet surrounded by the soft glow of holiday lights. The gathering was small, just immediate family, but filled with the kind of contentment that comes from shared joy and mutual respect. David seemed more relaxed than he had been in years, perhaps because the arrival of his granddaughter had reminded him of what truly mattered in family relationships. He spent most of the evening holding the baby and telling stories about Emma's childhood that made everyone laugh and reminded us of happier times before family dynamics had become so complicated. As the evening wound down and we were preparing to leave, David pulled me aside for a private conversation that I had sensed was coming for months. Mom, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Not just for the wedding situation, but for all the years I let Sarah's insecurities and my own pride get in the way of supporting your relationship with Emma and your right to make your own decisions. I listened without interruption as David continued, his voice heavy with regret and self-awareness that had clearly been building for months. I realize now that when Sarah pressured Emma to reject your gift, she wasn't protecting our daughter. She was protecting her own expectations about inheritance and control. And when I supported that pressure, I wasn't being a good father or a good son. I was being a coward who chose the path of least resistance instead of standing up for what was right. The apology was more than I had expected, and more than I had dared to hope for. It represented genuine understanding rather than mere politeness, and acknowledgement of the real issues rather than surface-level family harmony. David, I said gently, I appreciate your honesty and I accept your apology. But more importantly, I hope you've learned something about the difference between supporting your wife and enabling her destructive behavior. Emma is going to need both of her parents to model healthy relationships for little Bertha. We talked for another 20 minutes about family dynamics, boundaries, and the importance of protecting the next generation from the mistakes we had made. It was the most honest conversation David and I had shared in years, and it gave me hope that our relationship could continue to heal and strengthen over time. As I drove home that night through streets decorated with Christmas lights and filled with the quiet peace of the holiday evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years earlier, I had been a grieving widow whose primary identity was accommodating other people's needs and expectations. The battle over Emma's wedding had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and to establish principles I hadn't realized were missing from my life. Now I was a great-grandmother whose name would be carried into the future by a little girl who would hopefully learn from both my mistakes and my victories. I was an advocate for elderly women's autonomy whose story had inspired others to stand up for their own rights. I was a family member who had learned the difference between love and control, and who was committed to modeling healthy boundaries for the generations that would follow. Most importantly, I was a woman who had learned that aging doesn't require accepting disrespect, that generosity doesn't create obligation, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable other people's worst impulses. The year ahead would bring new challenges and new opportunities. Baby Bertha would grow and develop her own personality. Emma and Marcus would navigate the complexities of new parenthood. The foundation would continue helping elderly women protect their autonomy and dignity. And I would continue living according to the principles I had fought so hard to establish, with grace, with boundaries, and with the unshakable knowledge that respect is earned rather than inherited, and that love without conditions is the only kind of love worth giving or receiving. Standing in my kitchen that Christmas night, looking out at the garden where Robert and I had planted so many dreams together, I felt profoundly grateful for the battles that had brought me to this place of strength and clarity. The woman who had emerged from the wedding drama was someone I was proud to be, someone worthy of the name that would now be carried by a new generation. And somewhere in the quiet of that winter evening, I could almost hear Robert's voice telling me he was proud of the woman I had become, and the legacy I was creating for the family we had built together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.